Last week, Bev told everyone that we would still be having our literature presentations, even though we wouldn't have school until April. This is very unfortunate for Abby and Brianna, because their parents wouldn't let them leave the house due to coronavirus. They went to Bev and they asked him if there was any other way that they could get out of their presentation. Bev said no, and they would still have to do it. Abby and Bree trusted Bev to grade their presentation fairly compared to the rest of the class, and they worked tirelessly on making sure that their presentation was fun, fresh, and funky. Eventually, they finished their presentation and gave it to Bev. Bev admired that they had worked so hard on their presentation and decided to give them 100%, despite the fact that they couldn't give third-hour AP Lang diabetes by giving them candy as a reward for their activities. This is similar to the story of Abraham, where he had to make a difficult decision based on his loyalty to God. Abby and Bree had a very hard task in front of them, but they trusted Bev to grade them fairly, and he delivered in the end. Much like what God did for Abraham.
So today's presentation will be Abraham by your favorite students, Abby and Brianna.
So first we'll be dealing with the characters, and Abraham is the main character in this story. Basically what had happened was that God promised him that he would have more children than there are stars in the sky. And after that, 10 years had passed, and he and his wife Sarah had their first child, Isaac. Abraham is basically a very loyal character. He's loyal and faithful to God, and this is shown when he's tasked with sacrificing his son to God.
So our next character that we'll be talking about is Isaac. Isaac is Abraham's eldest son, who was conceived when his parents were old, which basically made him a miracle. When he was a little bit older, his father took him to be sacrificed to God. This sacrifice was a test to show how loyal Abraham was to God, and Isaac survived.
So I'm sure we all know this homie, our guy in the sky, Mr. G.O.D., God, and basically in this story, God asks Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. This is just a method to see how loyal Abraham was to him. God knew that if Abraham was loyal, he would go through with sacrificing Isaac. When Abraham took Isaac to be sacrificed, God interfered with the ritual to tell Abraham to stop, because he then knew that Abraham was loyal.
Sarah isn't really mentioned in the story that much, but Sarah is Abraham's barren wife. God gave Sarah a son, Isaac. She is 90 years old when this happens. For the plot overview, we're just going to go through a little short video that's going to tell about the book of Abraham more in depth.
A long time ago in the land of Canaan, there lived a good and noble man named Abraham. He was an important man because God picked his family to play a part in the plan to rescue the whole world. In order to set this plan in motion, God made a covenant with him. A covenant is like a big promise that lasts forever, and God's covenant with Abraham was a special one. One cool night, God told Abraham to look up at the sky. "How many stars do you see?" he asked. Abraham gazed up into the cloudless sky, which was lit up in every direction with thousands of stars, as far as he could see. He knew that he could not count them if he tried, so he answered, "I do not know. There are too many to count." God already knew how many stars there were, but he was using it as an example to show Abraham just how big of a promise he was making. "I am going to give you more children in your family than there are stars in the sky." Abraham was very surprised to hear this. He loved the thought of having a huge family, but there was one problem. He and his wife Sarah weren't able to have any children, and now they were too old. It seemed impossible, but Abraham chose to trust God and believe his promise. And 10 years later, God kept that promise. Abraham and Sarah had a son named Isaac. Abraham loved God with all of his heart, and he was so thankful for the blessings that God had given to him. However, God was about to put that love to the test. In the days of Abraham, one of the ways that people showed their love and thankfulness was by bringing sacrifices to God. A sacrifice is like a gift. It's something that you give to God to show him that you are willing to obey him, even when it costs you something. Usually, people would sacrifice an animal, like a lamb or a goat. But when Isaac was still a young boy, God asked Abraham for a different kind of sacrifice. God said to him, "This year, when you bring me your sacrifice, instead of killing an animal and giving it to me, I want you to give me your only son, Isaac." Abraham was shocked. "No, not Isaac," he thought. "How can I possibly kill him? How can I give his life away?" But Abraham remembered God's covenant promise. God told him, "I will make you the father of many nations." Abraham knew that could not happen without a son, so he decided to trust God even though he did not know how it would work out. The next morning, Abraham got up early and gathered the supplies that they would need for the sacrifice and the journey up the mountain. He rounded up Isaac, kissed Sarah goodbye, and began the 3-day journey to the place where they offered sacrifices to God. Isaac had been on these trips with Abraham several times, and along the way he realized that something was missing. "Father, we forgot to bring something for the sacrifice," Isaac said to Abraham. Abraham replied, "Do not worry, son. God will provide for us a sacrifice." Abraham was quiet the rest of the trip, and Isaac could tell that something was not quite right. When they reached the top, Isaac began helping his father build an altar out of stones, all the while wondering what they were going to sacrifice. After they had finished placing the firewood on top of the altar, Abraham sat down with Isaac to explain what God was asking him to do. With tears filling his eyes, Abraham said, "Son, I love you so much. You are a gift from God to us, and He has asked me to offer you as a sacrifice to Him. As much as it hurts me, I am going to put my trust in our God." Isaac did not fully understand, but he trusted his father as much as his father trusted God, so he agreed. Abraham wept as he tied up his precious son and laid him on the altar they just built together. He reached for his knife, tears streaming down his face, and raised it in the air. More than anything, he wanted to cut his son free, but he knew what he had to do. He took one last look at his son and said, "I love you, my boy." And with that, he reached out the knife above Isaac, with his hand shaking and his heart hurting. He was willing to obey God and take the life of his only son. Suddenly, just before Abraham went through with the sacrifice, he heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Stop!" Abraham froze. He knew that voice. It was God. "I don't want you to kill the boy," God continued. "I want him to live. I now know that you love me because you were willing to sacrifice your only son." Abraham fell to his knees and thanked God, grateful that he would not lose his son. He cut Isaac loose and gave him the biggest hug a father has ever given his son. He still had tears running down his face, but now they were tears of joy. Just then, they heard a rustling noise in the woods behind them. They turned to see a ram whose horns had gotten caught in some branches. Isaac remembered what Abraham had told him on the way up the mountain. "Look, Father, God provided an animal for the sacrifice, just like you said He would." On the way back home, Abraham walked with his arm around Isaac, holding him closely. He thanked God for His goodness and knew more than ever that he could trust God with everything.
We're just going to go through a quick summary of what you should have learned through this timeline of events. In the beginning, God forms a covenant with Abraham, stating that He will give him a son through whom a mighty nation would arise. But Abraham doubts God's promise at one time and tries to have a child with his servant Hagar. Next, God gives Abraham and Sarah a child named Isaac. God tells Abraham to sacrifice his only son.
So after the rising action, Abraham reluctantly brings his son to Mount Moriah and lays him on the altar. And as he's about to sacrifice his son, God told Abraham not to kill Isaac and gave him a ram instead. So, because Abraham brought his only son to be sacrificed, he basically passed the test of faith because Abraham put his trust in God to know that he was doing the right thing. And God knew that he was loyal, so he had him stop and not sacrifice Isaac and basically live out the rest of his life happily.
This video described how I and Abby were Abraham and Bev was God. Our presentation is the sacrifice. We trusted Bev to grade us fairly, even though the presentation was hard, and in the end, he delivered.
So our first illusion is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. The author Mark Twain, satirically creates a conflict between Huck and Jim using 19th century morals. Huck is constantly pressured on whether or not to keep his friendship with Jim or turn him in to the police. In this case, the illusion is Huck's moral as God's test. So our second illusion is Willa Carter's My Antonia. In this story, there are two Russian brothers who are tested when their wedding party is chased by a pack of wolves. They sacrifice the newlyweds to the wolves and basically fail the ritual in this case. So basically this curses them, and they're shunned by society and have to live out the rest of their lives in shame because they basically failed God's test.
For our third illusion, we'll be using the movie The Sun Also Rises. There were two men pursuing a woman. This represents a trial of character. The two men, Pedro and Khan, battle over Brett. Khan always physically wins the fight, but when it comes to morals, Pedro succeeds by not overreacting. In this story, the characters must go through a trial that God gives them to see if they are loyal to their morals. Now on to the lessons to be learned in Abraham and Sarah. Always keep faith in God no matter the cost. God will always provide a way for a person as long as you keep trust in Him. You must learn to give what is special to you, and you will be rewarded for your efforts. Sacrifice comes in all shapes and sizes, and doesn't always come with answers. The greater the cost, the greater the sacrifice.
So, in conclusion, the story of Abraham exemplifies the idea of giving up what a person loves dearly in order to show your faithfulness. Abraham, in the end, did not lose his son because he trusted God.